Welcome! Today I would like to discuss why companies choose to infringe on competition law and be non-compliant. Most, if not all, companies like to brand themselves as compliant and very committed to respecting law and regulations, including competition law. Companies, enforcers, and consumers share a common interest in promoting competition compliance and fostering a compliance culture. That is not always the case for companies, as compliance would otherwise be self-executing, but most companies want to be compliant on balance. That begs the fundamental question of why companies choose to be non-compliant when it comes to competition law. The general perception, as seen in movies, newspapers, and with enforcers, is that companies gang up against the free market deliberately, consciously, and with malicious intent. Moreover, this is the general practice across industries. Make no mistake, cartels are real. The lysine cartel is a prima facie example of this. As you might know, the FBI infiltrated the cartel and managed to film several of the meetings. On the left, you can see an example of such a meeting where the cartel members discuss quotas and target prices. The lysine cartel was turned into a movie. The Informant with Matt Damon, highly recommendable. Even if you are not interested in competition law, you will find it entertaining. We don't even need to turn to Hollywood to find examples of heinous cartels. The Danish electricity cartel from the 90s was also turned into a movie. A more recent example is the construction cartel that roamed in the late zeros, or the most recent wholesale electricity trading cartel. None of these have the punch to make it into a movie, but the infringements are real. Returning to why companies choose to engage in cartel activities. The general perception is that this represents a rational business decision, as cartels are profitable. Cartels can be profitable, but not always. In practice, cartels tend to result in inflated costs and unprofitable companies surviving longer than they should have. Another misconception is that cartels are something that takes place in the shadows and outside the light of the public. That might be the case. In the lysine cartel, the involved companies took steps to cloud their illegal activities, including forming a fake trade organization. That provided cover for their meetings. Cartels are real, on balance, profitable, and often they involve secret meetings, but focusing too much on this might miss some central points. Establishing an understanding can be very daunting, and enforcing it subsequently can be even more complex, if not impossible. Don't take my word for it. Check out this book. It analyzes a large number of cartels in the EU and the US, and based on this identity, some fundamentals. One of the things that surprised me was how complex it was to establish and maintain a cartel. The problem with maintaining the cartel is how members have an incentive to cheat. That is, by offering secret discounts. And even if that is not the case, it can be hard to ensure compliance. Most cartels, therefore, tend to collapse by themselves. Returning to the lysine cartel, you can see how it collapses periodically, transcending into trade wars. One way of stabilizing the cartel is to appoint an enforcer. That could be a trade organization that collects confidential data and monitors compliance. In the Danish electricity cartel that was turned into a movie, a muscle man was appointed and took drastic action to punish failure to respect agreed quotas. As mentioned in the lysine cartel, the involved companies formed a fake trade organization to provide cover for their illegal meeting activities. Appointing an enforcer does not guarantee against collapses and trade wars. As seen here, the lysine cartel collapsed several times, resulting in trade wars. What does this mean for compliance? Most companies adopt a compliance approach centered on avoiding careless conversations, comments, or the sales staff participating in secret meetings with no legitimate or clear purpose. This is why you might have heard lawyers recommend a strong and clear reaction if confronted with any such attempts, for example, suspicious invitations or suggestions during a meeting, to avoid misunderstandings. The latter would be that your company was interested in entering into an illegal cartel agreement. That is a prudent approach as it eliminates any misunderstanding. While insufficient to establish a cartel that competitors act parallel, it does look suspicious. In practice, a meeting followed by increased prices will draw attention. But remember that correlation does not imply causation. In case you did not know, there is a perfect correlation between Nicolas Cage's acting career and the number of people drowning in swimming pools in the US. Hopefully, you did not consider the two factors linked. This also means that enforcers and victims tend to look for unusual patterns in prices and bids, including the identity of bidders, companies that abstain, and who wins. Translated to the lysine cartel, that would include looking for sudden and unexpected price spikes. Some have even deployed AI to provide for this, including screens for possible cartels. It's always prudent to be vigilant, but from an enforcement perspective, it's no longer cartels that dominate DG Comp's enforcement agenda. In recent years, we have seen fewer and fewer 101 cases, indicating that the EU uncovers fewer and fewer cartels. The drop is even more drastic if we look closer into the data, as more and more infringements are closed without fines or with reductions. This indicates how the traditional management cartel, established and operated by senior management, might represent the past. We can see some of the same trends in Danish practice. Out of 896 Danish cases between 1998 to 2024 involving Article 101, only some 14% were so aggravated that fines were warranted. Often the misdeeds didn't even involve a cartel, but restrictive practices in a vertical agreement. Typically, retail price maintenance clauses. Many Danish cases even had obvious mitigating circumstances. An example of this was the Association of Undertakers. In 2010, it was revealed that they had banned their members from using TV advertising to market their services. I don't know about you, but I find it somewhat distasteful to run advertisements for the services provided by an undertaker, making it evident that this infringement hardly qualified as a malicious cartel. Rather than focusing on the intended cartels, it is the unintended cartels nobody intended to establish that should worry compliance officers. There are many ways to end up in a cartel infringement. Today, we will limit ourselves to looking at 4. A classic way of infringing competition law is through restrictive contractual clauses. The disco cartel is a primer on this. Here, nightclubs had formed an alliance to train staff and procure alcohol. However, they had also included a non-establishing clause regulating the opening of new clubs. The Danish Competition Authority identified a cartel. Before we move on, we need to offer a few words on Article 101 to understand why a non-establishing clause can be seen as a market-sharing arrangement. Article 101 rests on a distinction between restrictions by object and effects, where the former are arrangements directed at restricting competition, while the latter are those that have this as an indirect but unintended effect. We will not go into details on this, but the practical consequence is that arrangements that only indirectly facilitate price coordination or market sharing might be seen as such. Restrictions found to have an anti-competitive object are considered to infringe upon Article 101 almost per se and without further analysis. In contrast, a contrafactual analysis must be done regarding restrictions that are only anti-competitive by effect. The line is not always clear, as surrogates are included, why clauses that in practice create a market allocation could be seen as such as already indicated. The compliance consequence of this is that when it comes to contracts, it's best to have your lawyers review them before conclusion. Naturally, your lawyer can make mistakes, but at least you then have someone to blame. Another concern that accounts for how companies end up in a cartel is group-associated companies, usually subsidiaries, where someone intentionally or unintentionally engages in cartel infringement. Under competition law, the group is accountable for infringements committed in subsidiaries, and through this, the group is guilty and cartel member. One of the ways to look for possible infringements in subsidiaries is to look for so-called plus factors. These are factors making it more likely that infringements will take place. This would be the rotation and exchange of employees between competitors in a sector, making it more likely that trust can be built. It would also be a sudden and unexpected increase in profitability or a management incentive scheme that awards short-term optimization. If we return to our lysine cartel, we see a sudden spike in profitability that could be identified using proper screens. Another concern that accounts for how companies end up in a cartel is what, lacking a better word, could be referred to as careless comments that could be misunderstood and indicate unwanted interests and opinions. In the EU case T-Mobile, there was a single meeting where sales representatives discussed commercially sensitive matters like pricing and remuneration. This was sufficient to establish a cartel, including all that had participated in the meeting and failed to distance themselves from the idea of colluding on prices. In T-Mobile, the cartel was real. That was not the case in a Danish case about veterinarians. In the meeting summary, the parties had relied on wording indicating interest in establishing a price cartel. During the criminal case, this was cleared to be a misunderstanding. The discussions pertain to securing access to veterinarian services over the weekend and during holidays. The parties were acquitted of wrongdoing, but not before having endured a criminal trial. Obviously, not all discussions are problematic. The shared comments must pertain to something that can serve as the focal point for a conspiracy. That would be sensitive issues, such as future pricing or customers. If the information is old, it would often be unable to bring about collusion. I think much can be attained through target compliance training focusing on what we do not discuss or share outside the company, including with competitors. As indicated initially, a trade organization often functions as an enforcer in a cartel, and some have even suggested that if stripped of a trade organization, cartels collapse by themselves. Don't panic. Just exercise caution and avoid sharing sensitive and internal information within a trade organization. And no, relying on a shared AI to optimize prices is not an excuse. In the US, we are seeing some cases involving this, and it would be plausible that these will also come to the EU. One legitimate activity of trade organizations is to help with standardization and benchmarking, and that does not per se infringe upon competition law. However, if required to share sensitive internal information, ensure they are old and consolidated. It would also be recommendable to leave the consolidation to third parties and take steps to ensure it's impossible to identify the individual contributors, nor use the date as the focal point for coordination. In conclusion, a risk approach should be adopted, focusing on the most plausible compliance risk regarding competition law. That would often be restrictive contract covenants, rough managers in subsidiaries, and the activities undertaken in trade organizations. No plan survives first contact, but it's always better to be prepared and have a plan than to have neither. As always, I have provided links to the resources I have relied upon. Regarding the lysine cartel, just Google it. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the presentation and learned something. And feel free to reach out with questions or comments.